Solve x squared minus 12x plus 11 equals 0. This is a polynomial equation. It is an equation that has a polynomial in it. And we cannot solve polynomial equations using the same methods that we used earlier when we looked at linear equations, equations that didn't have x squareds in them. The problem here is that there's two terms with x in it. We've got an x squared and we've got a negative 12x. And there's no way to combine those terms because one of them is an x squared and one of them is just an x. They're not like terms. And so we're stuck with these two x's. There's no way to get x alone by itself on one side. So what we need to do is we need to use factoring, and we need to use a property called the zero factor property. And that's what we're going to use when we're solving polynomial equations. The zero factor property says the following. If we have a product, a times b, and that product equals 0, then either that first factor is 0 or the second factor has to be 0. Basically, if we want to multiply two things to get 0, one of them has to be 0. There's no other way about it. Either one of them is 0 or maybe both of them are 0, but it's not possible to multiply two numbers that aren't 0 and end up getting 0. Now, why is this important when we are looking at factoring? Well, factoring is a way of writing something as a product. We want to have a product that equals 0, and when we're looking at polynomials, writing a polynomial as a product just means factoring. So I'm going to rewrite this down here so we've got a little bit more space. X squared minus 12x plus 11 equals 0. And we're going to factor that polynomial on the left-hand side. Since it's a trinomial and the leading coefficient is 1, we're going to use unfoiling. And so it's going to be x plus or minus one number and x plus or minus another number. We're looking for the constant terms, and we know that they will have a product of 11 and a sum of negative 12. Well, those numbers are going to be negative 11 and negative 1. So when we factor this, this becomes x minus 11 times x minus 1 equals 0. So why does this help us? Well, we have just rewritten the equation as a product of two things, which we can call a and b, and that product is equal to 0, which is exactly what we have in the zero factor property. And the zero factor property says if that product equals 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0. And so that's exactly what we're going to examine. In this case, a is x minus 11. So we're going to set that equal to 0 because we know that either that factor is 0 or the other factor, b, is 0. In this case, b is x minus 1. So we're going to say or x minus 1 is 0. And now we've split it up and we have two equations, and each of those equations only has one x in it. So we can solve for x. For the first one, if we add 11 to both sides, that gives us x equals 11. And for the second one, if we add 1 to both sides, that gives us x equals 1. And so our final solution is going to be x equals 11 or x equals 1. For all of these problems, we're going to do a few things. First, we're going to get all non-zero terms on one side. Basically, we need one side of the equation to be 0 because that's how the zero factor property works. So we need to get all those other terms onto one side. So we have some polynomial equals 0. Then we need to factor the polynomial. which is what we did here. We took x squared minus 12x plus 11, and we factored that into x minus 11 times x minus 1. And then once we factored it, we take each of those factors and we set them equal to 0. We said that first factor, x minus 11, equals 0, or the second factor, x minus 1, equals 0. So the next step is to set each factor equal to 0. And then after we do that, we've got equations, and we can solve those resulting equations to get the values of x that are our solutions. So solve the resulting equations. And that's what we're going to do for all of these problems. We're going to get all the terms on one side so that the other side is 0. We're going to factor that polynomial. We're going to set each factor equal to 0. That takes advantage of the 0 factor property. And then we're going to solve the equations that we get from setting them equal to 0. Let's look at some more.